Good afternoon, everybody. This is Unidentified Flying Objects. And as you can see from the subtitle, what I'm addressing here is, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial origin? I'm not talking about reports of UFOs. I'm not talking about reports of alien abductions. I'm just talking about, of all the images that we tend to see, usually on the web, but perhaps in books and magazines, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial origin? So let's start by just thinking about some statistics. If we ask, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? Then what we find is that in a survey, we find 40% of people would answer yes to that question. This is a survey, as you can see on the bottom, conducted by Chapman University, 2018. That's the most recent one I could find. So quite a number of people, this is probably Americans rather than world population, but quite a few individuals believe that extraterrestrial aliens have visited Earth, perhaps as many as 40%. But rather than thinking about the past tense, if you ask a similar question, are extraterrestrial aliens actually walking amongst us at the moment? Well, you might think that's a much lower number, but actually it's 35%. So this might not be typical of the world population, but it is an indication of what people believe. Bear in mind that number is less than the number who believe in ghosts, which is 60%, greater than the number that believe in telekinesis, that's 25%, or Bigfoot, 20%. But perhaps more worrying in this particular survey is that the number of people who believe that extraterrestrials are currently walking amongst us is greater than the number of people who believe in evolution, which is 31%. That's an entirely different story. So for the moment, we're going to concentrate on the idea that UFOs are an indication, I'm hesitating to use the word proof, are an indication that extraterrestrials are visiting us. This cartoon was published a little while ago, quite a few years ago, and it's a reminder that the number of people who are carrying cameras with them everywhere they go in their mobile phones has been increasing since the noughties, since 2000, 2005. The number of people that have got a camera with them at all times has escalated to the point that surely, if everybody is walking around with a camera, doesn't that mean that we've conclusively settled the argument of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, whatever? Decades ago, very few people had a camera. If they saw something unusual, they very rarely were able to capture that. But now, surely, everybody has a camera, and therefore, if there were such things as flying saucers or Bigfoot or ghosts, surely we would have known that by now because there would be plenty of proof. Isn't it settled? Well, no, it's not settled. If you Google UFO, you find something like 250 million web pages dedicated to UFOs. And most of them are talking about UFOs being evidence for extraterrestrial visitation. Some of them aren't, but a lot of them are. So that implies that, despite the fact that there are so many cameras around in the world, no, the argument is not settled. So in this talk, I'm going to look at a number of UFO images, or at least images that could be interpreted as UFOs, and I'm going to classify them according to man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, or deliberately faked. And of course, to be fair, there is a fifth category of UFOs, and that is UFOs might be evidence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. So I'm going to look at each of those five categories. Just to make sure that we all understand what the definitions are, I'll conform to the convention that when I talk about a UFO, I mean an object observed in the sky that is not readily identified. And regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I side with Carl Sagan, who said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Another useful tool for any scientist is Occam's razor. If there are two explanations for an observation, or in my case, if there are two explanations for an image, then the one that requires the least speculation is usually the better. And often this is paraphrased a little more succinctly as simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than more complex ones. So that's something to bear in mind whenever we're looking at images to come. Where do we find reliable information about UFOs? Well, in America, you go to a UFO information centre, but in the UK, we don't have many of those dotted around. Of course, an ideal UFO image, an ideal UFO photograph, if you like, would be something like this. It would be clear, it would be detailed, it would be in focus. There would be no evidence for the camera moving when the picture was being taken. It would be well exposed. And if we had a number of images that looked like that, it would be a lot easier to come to the conclusion whether or not UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. But unfortunately, most UFO images don't look like that. They are not clear and detailed and in focus, etc. Most UFO images look much more like that. They're usually blurred, they're usually out of focus, there's usually camera movement adding to the amount of blurriness in the photo, and if they're taken at night, they are almost universally overexposed as well. If we blow that up, do we see anything new? No, we just see a bigger splodge of light. And you could argue that 90%, possibly 95%, maybe 99% of images of UFOs, especially those taken at night, look like that, and we can glean essentially no information whatsoever from them. It is simply a splodge of light, a blurry patch of light, and it is almost impossible to tell what the origin of that particular image is. And therefore, the vast amount of imagery that exists in the archives, unfortunately, cannot actually be analysed. You can't sit down and figure out what it was that was being photographed. So that's a bit of a shame, but we're going to have to look at the remaining images in which we can make some argument as to what the images are that we're looking at. I wondered what the first UFO image might be, and I found this image of a hieroglyph. When I first saw this, and I thought, well, in the top left we appear to have an Apache helicopter, and over here we seem to have Luke Skywalker's speeder, and I don't know what that is, but maybe that's a Zeppelin sitting underneath it. When I first saw this image, I assumed it had simply been faked in Photoshop or some other graphics software. Somebody had manipulated the image. But actually, this is a genuine photograph of a patch of wall, of some hieroglyphs. And if you understand that and think, well, this is not image fakery, but actually these things do exist if you were to stand in front of them, but the explanation is still a little more mundane than the fact that the Egyptians might have actually seen a helicopter or a land speeder or something else. Once you realise that pharaohs make their own marks in the wall, and when one pharaoh takes over from another, they add their own hieroglyphs, but they don't necessarily do a very good job of expunging the previous set of hieroglyphs. So once you realise that we're actually looking at two sets, especially if we colour code them accordingly, you can see that if we've got two sets of hieroglyphs in blue and green, you can see that if they are both, as it were, showing through and one does not remove the other, now you can see why it is we get the impression of a helicopter or the impression of a land speeder when we look at them separately in terms of the red and the green, the blue and the green hieroglyphs. We realise that there's nothing actually very interesting going on here. So it is an interesting little red herring, but unfortunately a simple explanation. So let's start with looking at them classified according to man-made, natural, etc. Let's look at UFOs which are probably man-made rather than extraterrestrial. The US Air Force has tried to make it a little easier for us by giving us this identification chart and showing us various silhouettes of things that you might see in the sky and breaking them down in terms of what they actually are. You may think that some of these look a little extraterrestrial, some of them might look a little bit like spy planes. Well, no, you're wrong. According to the Air Force, the first object is actually a weather balloon. The second one is a weather balloon. The third one is a weather balloon. The fourth one is a weather balloon. The fifth one is a weather balloon. Any idea what the next one is? Swamp gas. The next one is a weather balloon, and then there's a weather balloon, and no, that's not the Enterprise, that's a weather balloon, and again, not a super secret stealth aircraft, that's in fact a weather balloon. So You can say, regardless of what you see in the sky, you may think it's a top secret military project. It's more likely to be a weather balloon or swamp gas, according to the US Air Force. But if you did look into the sky and see something like that, how could you not think UFO? Rocket trails, which have become very popular recently, especially with the launch of various Falcon rockets. If the rocket contrail, the trailing, if you like, exhaust gases and products that are left behind by the rocket going through the atmosphere, if that contrail happens to catch the sun, and in this particular image you can see from the horizon the sun is just below the horizon, and so if you get to enough altitude you can catch the sun, and then you can get the contrail lit up by the sun's rays. And so although it might catch you by surprise, it produces some wonderful images which do look rather amazing. So this one is labelled a space jellyfish just because of its appearance, but depending on from what angle you happen to photograph that particular contrail, you can get some wonderful images. So for instance, the contrail can seem to produce a lot of fantails, or if you're looking from the right angle, if you're looking along the contrail, you can get some spectacular images which look like nebulae in space. And again, depending on where the sun is relative to the contrail, it's possible that you get some wonderful iridescence like you get here. The colours are coming through. Strictly speaking, the colours aren't in the contrail themselves. It's the way the sun's light is being refracted through the contrail in the distance. And the contrail doesn't look like a straight line, even if the rocket took a straight line getting into orbit. The winds in the atmosphere will distort the contrail over time, over minutes, over hours. The contrail can distort into wonderful structures. Again, if you were unprepared for it and you looked out into the sky and you suddenly saw a lot of cyan and blue and odd-shaped dots in the sky, you may be convinced that you were looking at unidentified flying objects. This particular image has a faint aurora in the background, northern lights. And what we're seeing a little bit closer, still high in the atmosphere, but a little bit closer than the northern lights, are the results of rockets that have been sent into the upper atmosphere and then dispersing various chemicals, excuse me, various gases that fluoresce again in the sun's light. And by releasing gases at various altitudes and watching how the gas disperses, you can get an idea of the atmospheric dynamics, what is actually going on in the upper atmosphere. So we get a slightly better understanding of atmospheric physics and the aurora themselves by looking at sounding rockets which effectively have released gas at various altitudes. But if you didn't realise that was what you're looking at, then again this could be perhaps a little bit confusing and perhaps easily misinterpreted as unidentified flying objects. In the bottom there I've indicated that this was an astronomy picture of the day, APOD, and the date there. If any of you go to that NASA webpage, there's a very nice webpage that every day updates with a new picture, and I've taken some of the images in this talk from the Astronomy Picture of the Day website. What do you think is going on with these rather strange lights in the sky? They seem to be moving, they slow down, they speed up, they change in their orientation with respect to each other. They occasionally make some odd looking shapes in the sky, and occasionally they change colour. And it might be that we see a lot more of this in the future, because this is the result of some enterprising individual putting lights on a lot of individual drones and then flying them in formation. So it might be that you would hear the drones if you were actually seeing this for yourself, but depending on the distance at which you see these things, you might only see the lights in the sky and not realise that it was being controlled by some individual on the ground. In some cases, the drones themselves have a certain amount of autonomy in that they can navigate and move relative to the other drones if each of them has a little GPS system on board so that they know exactly where they are. They can maneuver relative to their neighbours, and so you can get this impression of a swarm of lights, a bit like a murmuration of starlings in the evening. You can get a whole load of lights behaving as if they were almost intelligent and behaving like an intelligent being in the sky. But once you realise that they are simply drone helicopters with lights on them, the explanation gets altogether mundane. Some individuals have claimed to see UFO landing pads on the ground, here taken from an aircraft, the engine cowling in the foreground there. They were flying along over the desert. They looked down and saw what they believed was 3 UFO landing pads in the middle of the desert. Well, you could interpret them that way if you wish, but all it takes is a little bit of detective work and say, well, when did I photograph this? The aircraft was flying from A to B, and I was one third of the way through my journey, for instance. You can work out where in the world you were when you took the picture, and with a little bit of like Google Earth or something like that, or even just look at a map, you can then find what it was you were photographing. And although it looks rather odd from a height of 10,000 meters or so, when you realize what it is that you're actually looking at, it's basically a whole load of reflective mirrors. And this was presumably a solar power station where the light from the individual mirrors was focused onto the central tower. And depending on how you view these mirrors, what angle you are relative to the mirrors, what angle you are relative to the sun, sometimes the sun can catch those mirrors and give you this rather odd effect, such that from a great distance you get a rather odd looking arrangement there that perhaps doesn't look like simply a large number of small squares sitting on the ground. There's plenty of videos around. This is a video of somebody who was convinced they saw a UFO. You see, part of the problem is people don't seem to be able to keep their phone still whenever they're getting excited about a UFO. They also haven't figured out that holding it landscape is better than holding it portrait. But this individual was convinced he'd seen a UFO floating on the other side of this lake. And this was put onto YouTube, and a lot of people said, wow, what an amazing UFO. Even when it was explained, people were still thinking, well, it probably is a UFO, even though relatively soon after this was posted on the web, Goodyear said, sorry guys, we don't want to get in the way of a good story, but I'm sorry, that is quite definitely us. That is the Goodyear blimp. Even when that has been explained that that's what it was that was photographed, people still look at the video and say, wow, what an amazing cigar-shaped UFO that you've caught there in your video. So even when there are rational explanations, people are sometimes loath to give up the idea that what's been imaged is actually an extraterrestrial spacecraft. At some point I was looking for images and maybe videos as well, and I saw a reference to, finally, somebody has managed to obtain super clear footage of a UFO. Not clear footage of a UFO, super clear. And I thought, great, finally somebody has got a video which clearly shows a UFO, and we're finally going to see the detail in this super clear footage. So I had a look at this particular video, and there it is, and there's the super clear footage of the UFO. And again, we see the same problem. If you've got a video camera or indeed a still camera, the temptation is to put it on the full zoom to have the maximum focal length, the biggest magnification you can get, in which case it's almost impossible to keep the camera still, regardless of whether it's a video camera or a still camera. It's then very difficult to point it at the object of interest. You might be able to see the object and you are very good at stabilizing your vision, but when it comes to a camera, it's then very difficult to hold that steady enough that you can zoom in on this particular object. After a few minutes of this video, it did get to the point where it steadied down a little bit. Perhaps the person taking the footage managed to steady himself or herself, or lean against a wall or something to steady them, and eventually it became clear what it was that they were actually imaging. And if we just wait until the last frame of this, we find that we get quite a good view of what it actually is. So in that sense, it is relatively clear, and now that we see it as a static image at the end of the video, we can see that what this is, this particular UFO, is not an unidentified flying object as such. It is simply a balloon, a mylar balloon. Possibly there was a birthday for somebody named Jeremy or Jennifer or something, and they've got a relatively large mylar balloon in the shape of a J, and that has escaped the birthday party and gone floating off. As soon as a mylar balloon happens to catch the sun, it can glint in all sorts of ways, and you get odd effects of light and you get odd effects of colour. But with a pair of binoculars or a photographic telephoto lens, it's quite clear what this object actually is, and again, not extraterrestrial in any sense of the word. So, a number of possible man-made objects are often mistaken for unidentified flying objects. Quite a large number in the category of natural objects, not necessarily man-made. So let's have a look at a few natural objects. I'm not sure you've ever come across this, but there is the Cloud Appreciation Society has a web page which includes a cloud of the month. Yes, I kid you not, there is such a thing as the cloud of the month, and every once in a while they show you some wonderful images, and some of them are simply beautiful images of clouds, and some of them have just the hint of UFO about them, especially, for instance, lenticular clouds, which have this particular disc shape, which sometimes can give you the hint of a flying saucer. But here's an interesting image. The object that's at the top there is simply a bird that happens to be flying by. But what's interesting here is this circle of features at the bottom of the cloud base. What appears to be almost a perfect circle of something sitting at the bottom of a cloud. And again, UFO conspiracy theorists would delight in saying, well, that's clearly the sort of footprint, if you like, of a big flying saucer that's just sitting in the clouds there. Well, possibly. But there is, again, a simpler explanation. We come back to Occam's razor. Is there a simpler explanation for what it is we're looking at here? And this is thought to be simply because there's an airport not that far away. It is almost certainly an aircraft in a circular holding pattern of some kind. And the aircraft is actually flying inside the cloud, so it's not visible, but it's just close to the cloud base. And what would be the contrail of the aircraft, the fact that the aircraft disturbs the pressure and temperature immediately behind it, it can actually disturb the formation of cloud in its wake, as it were. So as the aircraft is either circling or going in a hairpin here, it can actually produce these odd cloud structures, even though the aircraft itself is perhaps not visible and perhaps not audible either. So again, a relatively simple explanation for what we're seeing there. Another lenticular cloud, rather nice one on its own in this particular case. That, I think, is rather spectacular. It sort of reminds me of one of the opening sequences of Independence Day, the movie, in which a large extraterrestrial spacecraft comes out of a large cloud-type feature and then reveals itself over a city. In this case, it's simply a pretty cloud with the sun behind it, producing a rather spectacular image. And there are some clouds called full street clouds where, again, it looks like almost a paper punch has been taken to the cloud base. It looks like maybe a large circular object has come down and gone through the cloud layer and punched a big hole in it and then perhaps gone off and landed somewhere. You see a large one in the foreground and what appears to be perhaps a smaller one in the distance there as well. But these so-called full street clouds are a perfectly natural phenomena, and I won't go into the details of the atmospherics, but they have been known about and photographed for many, many years. So they look unusual, but there's no need for anything other than a standard atmospheric physics explanation. Some of these lenticular clouds can look particularly spectacular, and it is not uncommon to find a lenticular cloud sitting over mountain ranges or mountain tops. In this particular case, there's a lenticular cloud sitting over Mount Fuji, which I think is quite spectacular, but some people don't think it's spectacular enough, and so they take that image, put it into a piece of graphics software like Photoshop, other software is available, and then they take that image and decide to change it into something even more ridiculous. So the first one is quite spectacular. The need to add 4 more layers of this lenticular cloud is a bit over the top. I rather like these images that are about to come, these images of so-called light pillars. One of the reasons I like them is because I've never seen them before. You have to go to the right sort of latitudes where the atmosphere is cold enough to form ice crystals. So what we've actually got here is what appear to be searchlights coming up from the ground, as if we've got either a whole load of lights pointing upwards or possibly a whole load of UFOs just on the other side of those rooftops. But actually what we've got is ice crystals sitting in the atmosphere. And those ice crystals tend to be hexagonal plates, and those plates often sit close to horizontal. That just depends on what their size and shape is and how they prefer to sit in the Earth's atmosphere. But if they do sit horizontal, then they are effectively a large number of very small mirrors that can take light from a distance and reflect it back down to the ground, even though these crystals might be meters, tens of meters or hundreds of meters in the air. So what we're really just looking at are some lights. They might be street lights, they might be domestic lights or factory lights that are just out of view, but the light is being reflected down from the high back down to us on the ground, and we get this impression of light pillars. If the individual ice crystals are very well aligned with each other and all parallel, then these will be straight lines going up into the sky. If they're not quite so well aligned, then these pillars will be a little bit fuzzy. Again, you can see I've taken this image from Astronomy Picture of the Day back in 2013. But these light pillars can be quite remarkable in this particular case. Again, the same phenomena. Again, we can't see the origin, we can't see the source of light, which is somewhere just over the horizon. And we can see these light pillars. Some look a bit orangey, some look a little bit blue. That's simply a question of what is the original light source that's reflecting off the ice. It's not the ice itself that's colouring the light, it's the original source of light. So that's quite a nice one, but I think one of the best ones is this one, where the ice crystals are quite high in the air, quite high in the sky, and you can see the lights in this case, you can see the lights on the horizon that are being reflected off the ice higher in the sky. But if you didn't think about the horizon and just looked into the sky and saw these rather ethereal looking lights, again, it's sort of evocative of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where a large extraterrestrial spacecraft appears in the sky and is completely coated with lots of coloured lights. If you weren't aware of what it was you were looking at, it would be easy to look into the sky and think of that as some sort of UFO. Like I said earlier, sometimes these ice crystals are not particularly well defined. In this particular case, they're all nicely parallel with each other up to a particular height where I guess the temperature and possibly the humidity is changing, and there the ice crystals start to vary in their angle relative to the horizon, and so these light pillars start to fan out to give you this rather odd effect, which looks almost like trees sitting there with a light source at their base and then spreading out as they get higher and higher. In this particular case, the photographer is pointing a video camera up with a couple of houses either side. Look what's going on in the middle of the image. Something seems to be jumping around inside that cloud. Something jumps and jumps back again, and suddenly there's a change of light, and suddenly what appears to be an enormous acceleration of an object. And some people have said, well, given the distance to that cloud, something is moving very rapidly and then moving back again. Well, that's one way of interpreting what you're looking at, but again, it's perhaps not obvious, and it's easy to be a little confused as to what it is that you're looking at. But after a little bit of analysis, it was realised that nothing is actually moving in the macroscopic sense. We don't find that objects are actually moving from left to right or top to bottom. What's actually happening is a similar phenomena to what we saw in the light pillars. What we're looking at is reflection of ice crystals. This is a large thundercloud, it's very cold in there, there's probably a lot of ice crystals. And what can happen in a thundercloud is that as the electrical charges change, because for instance there's a lightning strike that you can't see, or a rebalancing of electric charge within the cloud, what can happen is the electric fields in there can suddenly change. And the electric fields can make the ice crystals line up in particular ways. So for a fraction of a second, the ice crystals might be lined up in one direction and reflect some light to the observer. from the sun, which is out of frame at the moment, and then a fraction of a second later the electric field can change, and the ice crystals don't necessarily move to a different part of the cloud. They might just reorient themselves, which can happen very rapidly. They're not having to move over 100 meters. All they have to do is to change their orientation, and that will change how much light is reflected to the observer and could give you the impression that things are jumping around inside that cloud and something is moving outside the cloud and then moving back into the cloud. But actually nothing is moving over that scale. It's simply a reorientation of ice crystals giving you different aspects of reflection. So that I thought was quite an interesting one. Another one that I borrowed from the astronomy picture of the day. This I don't think you're likely to see with your eyes. This is a set of sprites which occur or can occur above thunderstorms. So it's perhaps not obvious, but there's a thunderstorm down closer to the horizon, and these red sprites are above the thunderstorm. So we're used to the idea that if we have thunderclouds, we might get lightning between clouds or lightning down from the cloud to the ground. This is sometimes called high atmosphere or high altitude lightning. Strictly speaking, it's not really like lightning in the sense that it's not quite the same as a discharge from the cloud to the ground. It's more like a whole set of fluorescent lights. It's more akin to that sort of phenomena, whereby certain gases in the atmosphere are being illuminated because of the very strong electric fields that exist above thunderclouds. So yes, they do exist. Yes, they are red. Yes, they are rather ephemeral. I don't think they're anything as bright as would be indicated by this photograph. I think the photographer here has done a very good job of showing the sprites. I think they've gone unnoticed for many centuries simply because they are very difficult to see and very difficult to photograph. Again, astronomy picture of the day. Some of you who are interested in astronomy might recognize this particular object. It was reported from Canada that somebody had seen an arc-shaped UFO over Ontario. And in the description, I'll show you the image in just a second, but the description is, nearing the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye, brilliant white. Some of you might already have a clue as to what that is. What might you see at the end of the day at sunset if you're looking west? What bright, brilliant object might you be looking at? In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion is a UFO or UFO. This again is an indication of how people report UFOs. If they see something that they're not sure what it is, some people's knee-jerk reaction is, if I don't know what it is, it's a UFO. And it's obviously something extraterrestrial or something rather enigmatic. As opposed to, I don't know what it is, but it probably has a quite reasonable explanation. My friend thinks that the object is as big as 2 airliners. How can you work out how big an object is unless you know precisely how far away it is? If you know the distance to the object, you might be able to figure out its size. But if you're looking at a dot in the sky, how can you really understand what its actual size is? My friend thinks it's as big as 2 airliners. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. So these people are trying to figure out how big this object is, but in fact they've really got no idea. What was it they were looking at? They were looking west at the end of the day and they saw a very bright light. It's Venus. That's what you would expect. For half the time, Venus is going to be an evening star. For half the time, Venus is going to be a morning star. And Venus goes through phases. It goes through phases. It's a little bit difficult to see when it's a thin crescent. It's not altogether easy to see when it's that sort of phase. But for a lot of its time, it will be a half phase, or in this case, a little bit less than half phase. You can easily make out that phase with a pair of binoculars. If you see a bright dot in the sky that you think might be Venus, just get a pair of binoculars on it and you will see a half phase or a crescent phase, or maybe a little bit more than half phase. In this particular case, I think he or she has taken a video. and again has taken the camera to the extreme zoom and tried to keep the camera as steady as possible. In this case, they haven't done too bad a job. And if we take one frame from the video, then we can sort of make out the fact that, yes, that looks like a crescent Venus, and it certainly matches the description, the textual description on the side there. So anybody who claims that Venus is a UFO simply either hasn't seen Venus before in the night sky or is very unfamiliar with any aspect of astronomy. But given that, as I say, Venus is an evening star for about half of the time, it should have been seen by a lot of people a lot of times, but still it catches people out. So we've thought about man-made objects, we've thought about natural objects. What about image artifacts? If somebody takes a picture and says, I've taken a picture, but once I looked at the picture after it was developed, or when I look on the back of the camera if it's a digital image, I wasn't aware of something interesting going on, but now I've taken the picture, I can see something odd, that should immediately tell you that this is an artifact. If you didn't see it at the time, but now you see it on the photo, it's an artifact of the photo. But people don't tend to think that way. 1952, mysterious lights photographed over Washington, D.C. So this was published as, look at this, we've got a little fleet of aircraft flying in the background. Clearly there's quite a few of them, clearly they're in formation. This is before the era of drones, and it's unlikely to be anything else. You don't see aircraft doing this, you don't see helicopters doing this. So we have this rather unusual flight of UFOs over Washington, D.C. Well, yes, that's one way of interpreting that, but there's an alternative. Don't look at what's in the sky, look at what's in the foreground. In the foreground we see a whole load of street lights. If we take those street lights, turn them upside down and move them to the top of the image, what do we find? The pattern of street lights is a dead match for the pattern of the lights we see in the sky. In other words, we're just looking at a reflection. I've turned it upside down because reflections will normally be upside down relative to the original light source. So when you've got bright lights shining into the lens of the camera, it is not at all surprising to find that we get reflections of those bright lights. And by simply testing that, we can see immediately we have a single light here which produces this little image. We have two here which produces these two. We have two there which produces these two, etc. I would hazard a guess that if you were to look at the light source of these lamps, you will find that they all tend to double up. It is possible that that doubling up is purely a movement of the camera. It could be from the original lamps. It's difficult to tell from the edge of the building. It does look a little bit fuzzy, but I'm not sure about the quality of the original image. It could be that the camera has just moved ever so slightly and you don't tend to notice it on the original images, but you notice it on these reflections that they all seemed to be doubled up. But what you can fairly conclusively say is that those dots in the background are not flying objects flying behind the building. They are simply reflections of lights that are within the image itself. What about this rather odd looking object? It was described as a large craft that came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. I'm not sure what the windows are. I think perhaps they're referring to that part of the object, and that's a window, perhaps with a pilot staring out at you. But you have to bear in mind how the image was taken. Claiming that this is a UFO sighting, which is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth, is stretching it a little bit. Putting aliens in capital letters doesn't make it any more convincing that this is actually an image of an alien. You really need to see the whole image to understand what it is that you're actually looking at there. On its own, that could be almost anything. But when you realise that's part of an image in which the photographer is pointing their camera at what I guess is a very bright moon, it might be a full moon, it might be a gibbous moon, but it is quite definitely a very bright, overexposed object, and it is not surprising that when you shine a very bright light into a camera you get a reflection. The reflection here looks rather distorted, but without knowing the details of which camera took it and which lens and what did that lens look like, I can't comment on why the reflection looks the way it does, but the fact that we are looking at a very bright object there tells me that it is entirely reasonable that somewhere within the image we will end up with a distorted reflection of that very bright object. Bringing it more up to date, if we look at an image that's been posted on Twitter, somebody said, "What is this in the sky?" They mentioned that they didn't notice it at the time, but it seems to be there in the image. This particular object floating in the sky seems to have a little bit of an aura around it. Is it a UFO? This person asks. And because this is a tweet, this is on Twitter, they then followed it with hashtag UFO. And to show that they were being entirely serious and they were asking, "What do you think it is?" They then followed that up with hashtag serious question. So they did genuinely want to know. But this idea of, "I don't know what it is, therefore is it a UFO?" again seems to be a knee-jerk reaction. Looking at this, it doesn't take too much to figure out that what's going on. We're looking at an image where somebody was interested in that particular lamp and they were getting this artistic effect by shooting into the sun. So the sun is coming through that filigree bracket and is shining directly into the camera. If we take that artifact, if we take that object and blow it up, perhaps we can be easily convinced that if the sun is actually shining through this region here, the sun might be half obscured and half visible. So maybe the full disk of the sun is not visible, maybe only part of the disk is visible, and it's shining through the filigree work of this, this particular bracket. So is it surprising that what we end up with is a reflection which is a disk with some of it cut off because of that wall? And so it's a partial disc and we're seeing some of the filigree work of that bracket. Again, it's exactly the same but inverted. It's approximately the same size. It doesn't have to be, it could be larger, could be smaller, but generally speaking the reflection will be upside down relative to the original light source. And if the light source is bright enough, and certainly pointing it at the sun will give you a bright reflection, you will end up with an artifact that looks a little bit like this. Modern lenses, modern cameras tend to be very good at reducing reflections compared to lenses of 30, 40, 50 years ago. But if the source of light is bright enough, like the sun or the moon, you will get a reflection somewhere in your image. Other people have said, "Look at this image, this is clearly a UFO." I've found quite a few that fall into this sort of category. Note the power lines. I'm not sure what the power lines are. I think they're these diagonal slight white lines here. I think they're referring to these lines that go across the image. I don't know how well they show up in the screen that you're looking at. The person who took this image says, "As you can see, the wires show absolutely no distortion, which would indicate no camera jerk." So they claim that this image has been taken absolutely steadily because those lines don't show any blurring. Also, based on the wires in the photo, you can tell that we were shooting almost straight up. So they're claiming to take an object, a rather odd looking object, by pointing the camera directly upwards, and the camera is absolutely steady because these lines that they have pointed out are not blurred. I thought that was very odd. So I took the image and just manipulated it slightly to make it a little bit clearer what it is we're looking at. And now I think you can just about be convinced that what we're actually looking at is the view out of the side of probably a car, a van, probably not a coach. We're looking out the side window of a car at what is, I would guess, a wing mirror. And we're looking at the road, partly illuminated by headlights, and there's the verge of the road in the background. What are these power lines? Well, they're nothing to do with power lines. I think they're probably just scratches on the image. So scratches will be sharp. Scratches won't move according to camera shake. So this is a little bit of deliberate misdirection. This is not an image taken directly up. It's not an image in which the camera didn't move. The camera moved a substantial amount and the camera was simply pointing out at the side of a car or some moving vehicle of that I can't quite define. But as I say, it looks a little bit like a wing mirror, so I would guess this is a truck of some kind. This is perhaps one of my favourite ones. somebody that captured this huge slab in the sky. Not a conventional flying saucer in the circular sense. This was a large rectangular monolith slab in the sky. What appears to be a flat rectangular aircraft with lights all around its edges hovering in the air. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it is clearly an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Give it a name, give it a label, it sounds altogether more convincing. So, is this likely to be a large, flat, rectangular slab hovering in the sky? Or is it possible that this picture was taken through the windscreen of a car? Notice the raindrops at the bottom, scattering some of the light from oncoming headlights. So I would imagine that this was taken inside a car, of what's going on outside a car, through the windscreen. Is it not more likely that what we're looking at is the reflection of a mobile phone sitting on the dashboard? Imagine what that would look like if you had, for instance, an iPhone, a black iPhone with a silver trim around it. What would that look like? Well, that would pretty much look like that. So is it more likely to be a hovering spacecraft, or is it more likely to be the phone on your dashboard? You decide. UFOs we've looked at so far, man-made, natural and image artifacts. The fourth category is UFOs might be faked. Images of UFOs might be faked. Any image which requires somebody's finger pointing at the object is, well, okay, that was probably just a joke at the time. You clearly don't need somebody pointing at it to define your UFO. If you do, then it's not a very interesting sounding UFO. Any UFO that looks like that, again, if such a spacecraft did come out of the clouds and hover over an interstate, I think people would have noticed it. So I think we can safely say that that's a little bit of work inside a graphics package. As I say, could be Photoshop, it could be some other piece of software that's been used just to give that impression. This is claimed to be an image of Air Force One that's being buzzed by a couple of UFOs that are tailing it on sort of each wing. And I thought, when I looked at that, I thought that was interesting, and I just took a closer look at it. And I'm fairly convinced that's fake. It's difficult to actually prove it, but I'm fairly convinced that's fake, simply because if you imagine that Air Force One and those two UFOs are at a similar distance, if the UFOs are supposed to be tailing the aircraft, then they are both at a similar distance, clearly a long way from the photographer because of the amount of blurring and atmospheric distortion that we can see on Air Force One there. But if you look at that precise amount of atmospheric distortion, you can see that Air Force One has a little bit of blurring, and its contrast has been reduced by all of the air between the object and the photographer. But the UFOs don't seem to have suffered the same fate. The contrast in the UFOs appears to be rather high compared to the contrast in Air Force One. Why should that be? If they're at a similar distance, shouldn't the atmosphere have produced a similar amount of softening of the outline and the contrast of the objects themselves? So again, I don't think that's a very convincing UFO. This one I thought was good. This here we see what appears to be an aircraft carrier, the deck of an aircraft carrier on which is sitting a jet, a helicopter, and what appears to be a triangular UFO. I thought that's interesting. I wonder if there's any way of effectively proving that that is a fake image as opposed to not a particularly high resolution image of a scene taken on a carrier deck. So what I did was look at that F-18 jet, and I looked at a few pixels sitting next to it. I took the pixels along this line here, this grey line that my arrow is currently pointing at. There's a whole load of pixels there that are very similar level of grey, a very similar brightness. And I've chosen those because I didn't want to pick the detail of the jet itself. But if I plot how intense are the pixels as a function of where I am along that line, so from 0 to 70 pixels is a line going along the axis, if you like, of this takeoff runway on the carrier deck. and the height here is telling me how bright that pixel is. And it doesn't matter what the units are, the brightness of a given pixel is 68 or 69 or 70 or 71 or 72 units of brightness. They are all relatively similar because they're all a similar shade of grey. And what we see is perfectly normal variation in the brightness as we move along the carrier deck. We wouldn't expect it to be a straight line. We wouldn't expect it to be smooth because every image has a certain amount of noise. Every image, in this particular case, it was a JPEG image, and a JPEG image has certain artifacts in it, and you would expect the intensity to vary a little bit from one pixel to the next. So that's perfectly natural variation of intensity along what appears to be a genuine part of the deck of the aircraft carrier. And I've done that for comparison with what I'm going to do now, which is taking a similar region, but now next door to the triangular UFO. Now I've taken the region of the carrier deck, a similar length, a similar number of pixels, but now I've plotted the intensity along a line just close to the edge of the so-called UFO. And so again, we've got a variation along 70 pixels, and again, the average appears to be around 70, but look what happens to the intensity. It looks like there's normal variation and then a very suspicious flat plateau in the pixel intensities before it goes back to normal again. So I think I can say without a shadow of a doubt that image has been tampered with. That image has been smoothed or possibly blurred. Some tools, some image manipulation tools have been used. I would guess that the triangular UFO has been taken from somewhere else and it's been copied and pasted into the carrier deck, and then it's been tidied up around the edge to try and make it blend as convincingly as possible. And in the process of blending the UFO to the carrier deck, they've smoothed out the variations, which would never happen by chance. This is quite definitely the result of some manipulation of the image. And with image analysis or image processing tools, it is relatively straightforward to actually demonstrate that these images are not simply the images directly taken from a camera, but are the result of being played around with in image manipulation software. We can see the same thing if we look at this. I know you can't see much on the screen at the moment. This is claimed to be shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. I took this image and I thought, well, I can't really see what's going on. Let me take this image and brighten it so that I can see what's going on. What we see in the background is a lot of mottling. Again, this is perfectly normal. It might look a little bit odd, but then I've exaggerated this effect. This is perfectly normal noise or mottling that you would expect on any image. For instance, any image which is saved as a JPEG image, there will be some variation in the brightness of the sky in this particular case. And that particular structure that we see, that mottling, is perfectly normal, perfectly understandable. But look at the triangular object that's supposed to be in the sky. Its edges are very well defined. Bear in mind that this mottling should be something that occurs over essentially the entire image. We would not expect to find very well-defined triangle, very well-defined edges of a triangle if this image was natural, if this image was untampered with. So again, I think I can convincingly say that whoever produced this particular image or this particular video, it's the result of image manipulation. Here we see somebody that says, I photographed this out of the window of an aircraft as we were flying along, and suddenly we saw this UFO flying in the opposite direction. Again, a rather nice example of video manipulation in this case. It's not proof, but I think it's fairly convincing that if you look at that UFO, it bears a striking resemblance to one of the aircraft that's used in a certain video game that I can't mention for legal reasons, but basically if you ask a 10-year-old, you'll probably be able to identify which game that came from. They've taken this particular craft and they've softened it slightly and blurred it slightly and made it a little bit smaller to try and convince you that it's actually in the sky below the aircraft. But no, they've simply taken an image from elsewhere and inserted it into this particular video, of which I'm just showing you one frame here. So I've taken you through man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, and finally the fake images. But of course that does leave the fifth and final category, that of all the images that we're talking about, UFOs might be evidence for extraterrestrial spacecraft. There are a lot of UFOs out there. I like this particular sheet because it tells you that here we have written at the bottom 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So based on people reporting UFOs, somebody has tabulated or documented 80 different types of UFOs that are all presumably distinct from each other, distinct enough from each other that you can tell that if this person reports a UFO, then what they've actually described is E5, or they've actually described K3, or possibly F4 in their description of the UFO. I like the idea that it can be that well documented. I also like the fact that this is UFO sightings set 1, meaning that there is another set of perhaps another 80. So maybe there are 160 different types of UFO that can be documented from people's reports of UFOs. I don't claim you can get that from images. Whether you believe you can get that from authentic reports of people seeing lights in the sky or seeing objects in daylight, I'll let you think about that. What I do rather dislike is any TV program that comes up with a, here we have evidence of a UFO. You can clearly see from this shot taken in Rendlesham Forest, you can clearly see the evidence for a UFO having landed. And I look at that and think, where's the evidence for a UFO landing in that image? And they say, well, just to help you, let's just show you that clearly is the footprint of a triangular UFO. And you can see the 3 landing feet that it landed on and made impressions in this particular part of the forest. That is the sort of thing that I hate, when people say, here's evidence, look at that, and if you home into this particular aspect of the detail, I'm sure you can be convinced that what we're looking at is the landing pad of a triangular extraterrestrial spacecraft. How they justify that, how they sleep at night, I don't really know. But when it comes to thinking about extraterrestrials, I still don't believe that UFO images are evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. But if there's a lack of evidence, that does lead to a question. If you think about the number of stars in the Milky Way being about 300 billion or so, most of them have planetary systems. We didn't know this until fairly recently. If you go back a few decades, we really didn't know how many stars had planetary systems around them. Now we know most do. So there's probably 150 billion planetary systems in the Milky Way galaxy. And again, we didn't know until fairly recently how many of them were Earth-like. 20 years ago, we could only guess how many planets in the Milky Way galaxy were Earth-like. Now we've got a pretty good estimate. Roughly 1/3 of all the planetary systems contain an Earth-like planet. So that gives you a total number of about 50 billion. Earth-like, there's a little bit of artistic license with that. It means rocky-type planets that are not so different in mass or size from the Earth. That doesn't mean they are little blue marbles. It means that their mass and their composition are not so different from Earth. A big question is, if you start with an Earth-like planet at the right sort of distance from the star that it's orbiting, what is the likelihood that life originates? Some people will say life is inevitable. Some people say life is very unlikely. Let's, for the sake of argument, just say that 99% of the time no life ever gets hold. So we divide that number by 100, we end up with 500 million systems. What's the likelihood that life may develop into more complex life, multicellular multicellular organisms? Again, we do not know. Let's assume that 99% of the time, if life finds a way of starting, then it doesn't develop into complex systems. So complex life, we divide again by 100. That means 5 million systems out there. And again, very contentious. What is the likelihood that complex life eventually develops into some sort of intelligent life? We have no idea. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't get beyond complex organisms and doesn't develop intelligence. So let's divide by 100 again, 50,000. So we've said that Earth-like planets are quite common, but let's assume that intelligent life is only a 1 in a million chance. So if that was true, then we would have 50,000 intelligent species in the galaxy. I'm overlooking or deliberately sweeping under the carpet the question, how long would such a civilization last? Would they destroy themselves in 10, 100 or 1,000 years? Would they last for many thousands of years? I haven't addressed that particular issue. But even if life is 1 in a million, then there would be 50,000 civilizations in the galaxy, and if there were at some point during our history 50,000 civilizations, why is there no evidence whatsoever that any of them have ever existed? Is it possible that they've all kept themselves to themselves? Is it possible that we live in a part of the Milky Way that's so boring nobody ever visits us? Or is it the case that extraterrestrials have visited us and we keep mistaking them for UFOs? Maybe you remember this from 1994. That little pixel there is us. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. On a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The famous quote from Carl Sagan, "Pale blue dot." The pale blue dot is a sobering reminder that the only life we know about is terrestrial. The appearance of UFOs in our skies is not proof of visitation by extraterrestrials. But what I find more unsettling is the thought that we might be alone. Thank you all for listening.